Hi, in this lecture I'm going to talk to you about small world and scale-free networks. But before we start, I would like to mention a few things about modeling. So as I said in the first lecture, a model is a theory that is consistent with the data. It's a coarse-grained abstractions of the system. It needs to be cognitively and mathematically understood, so you can trace the variables in the models and you can understand its behavior. It needs to represent the structure and or the dynamics of the real system. It needs to be predictive. And one famous saying by George Box is that models are all wrong, but some are useful. So the application of network modeling of complex systems started in 1736 by Euler, who used the newfound field of graph theory in mathematics to prove the 7 bridges of Königsberg problem. A lot of advancement in graph theory and the application of network analysis in complex system was made by those two Hungarian mathematicians, Paul Erdős and Alfred Rényi, in the late 50s. What they did is to study the properties of random networks. So their famous random network model placed some buttons on a table and then connected those buttons with random connections. And they tried to understand the properties of those networks, of those graphs. And one of the properties is that nodes in those graphs have an average connectivity, and that connectivity distribution, if you plot the number of connections per node and the frequency of nodes having a specific number of connections, it follows a Poisson distribution which is similar to the normal distribution. It's a bell-shaped curve distribution. Erdős and Rényi were also famous for proving the problem of how many colors would you need in order to distinctly color states on a map. So in the late 90s, there were two seminal publications that really made a huge impact on this idea of applying network analysis to real-world complex systems. And the first paper was published in Nature by Steve Storgatz and Duncan Watts. And what they showed is that real-world systems follow this small world topology. So what does that mean? And this actually has a very specific mathematical definition. So real-world networks are not random, are not like the Erdős-Rényi model networks. They actually have these properties where they have high clustering coefficient and relatively short characteristic path length. So those are two network properties that can be measured: the level of clustering, the average distance between pairs of nodes. So Stephen Strogatz and Duncan Watts analyzed 3 complex systems abstracted to networks. One is the movie actor database, IMDb. They also analyzed a power grid system that lists transformers and generators. And also they analyzed the neuronal connectivity map of the worm C. elegans, where this worm is the only organism that we mapped its entire neuronal connectivity system. Worm has 200 neurons that we know that exactly how they're connecting. So as you see, they compare the actual L, which is the characteristic path length, to the L that is expected for random networks of the same size, as well as the C, which is a clustering coefficient, and compare that to the clustering coefficient expected in random network of the same size. So how do you compute the clustering coefficient and the characteristic path length? So to compute the clustering coefficient, or what the clustering coefficient means, is it's a measure of how the neighbors of a node are connected, the direct neighbor of a node are connected. And in this particular example, you can see that the red node has 4 neighbors. And in the first example, when the clustering coefficient when C equals 1, all of the neighbors are connected. So there are 6 possible connections that those 4 nodes can be connected, and in the first example on the left, all of them are implemented. In the middle, the C equals half, only 3 out of this possible 6 are implemented, and the clustering coefficient is 0 for that particular node if there are no connections between the neighbors. So you can compute the clustering coefficients of all the nodes in the network, and then the average is the clustering coefficient for the entire network. The characteristic path length is an average of all the shortest path distances between all pairs of nodes. One of the things that Watts and Strogatz did in their paper, they created a model that can generate a network that follows the same small world topology that real world networks also follow. So in this model, they started with a regular lattice and then gradually randomized the connections, taking a link and then putting it somewhere else. So they extracted one of those links and then gradually randomized the network. So if you do that process, starting with this regular lattice, going all the way to random network, somewhere in the middle, you're going to get a small world network. So what they've done as they go through this process of randomizing those links from the regular lattice to the completely random network, they can do a measurements of the clustering coefficient and the characteristic path length at every few steps. And what they found is like somewhere in the middle, you still are retaining the high clustering while your path length drops very rapidly. And this explains or fits the real-world topology, suggesting that there are shortcuts in real-world networks that connect modules that are highly clustered. So in this paper that was published in Science in 1999, Albert and Barabasi noticed is that real-world network connectivity distribution is not like the Poisson distribution that was reported by Erdos and Renyi in 1959. It's actually following a power law distribution, a power law. So the connectivity distribution has a power law density distribution histogram. And this is what is shown here. And then they also, like Watts and Strogatz, they had a model that can generate those power law distributed networks that they called scale-free networks. So let's look at how the model works. Instead of starting with all the nodes and all the links and gradually shuffling the links, the rich get richer model, network growth model that can generate scale-free networks or networks that have a parallel distribution starts with very few nodes that are randomly connected. So here we have an example of 5 nodes with some random links that connect. Then you start adding nodes and links to the system. So you're introducing nodes, growing the network in size until it reaches your desired size. And that growth model has some basic rules of how the new node that is introduced to the network will be connected to those other nodes. If we are interested in generating an Erdos-Renyi connected network, we will just randomly connect a new node and just grow the network by adding nodes and randomly connect those nodes to the network. However, with the rich get richer model, we are connecting the new incoming nodes by assigning a probability for each node to be connected to the new node based on the node's already existing connectivity degree. One of the things that Barabasi showed is the importance of hub nodes. Most of the nodes in the network have very few connections, either 1 or 2 connections. And then there are those highly connected nodes that, although there are not that many of them compared to the lowly connected nodes, there is a lot more of those hubs compared to the hubs that you can find in an Erdos-Renyi network. And those hubs are important components in the network. If you destroy those hubs, obviously the network will fall apart faster. And what they showed in these two papers that were published in Nature is that when you knock down genes that are highly connected in yeast, the viability of the organism is going to be much lower than if you would have knocked down genes that are lowly connected. So in these review articles that Barabasi wrote many years ago, he compared the view of a random network to a scale-free network. One of the criticisms about the scale-free model is that when you look at many complex systems, you see those power law distributions a lot. And this is because complex systems are made of diverse components, diverse agents. And those different types of agents will have different properties. When you're comparing a lot of things that are different, that are diverse, heterogeneous, then you will get those power law distributions. So this is not necessarily, or at least the opponents of the scale-free model suggest that this is not necessarily a feature of the structure of the system by design, but just because we are looking at a very diverse system. If you compare people's height, you will get a bell-shaped curve distribution. However, if you compare all animals' height and weight, you will probably get a power law because you are comparing so many diverse things. So now I'm going to turn my camera around and I'm going to show you what I'm looking at. And this is north part of New York City and Manhattan. And you can see that there are many buildings of many different heights that I'm looking at. And in this particular case, if you would have just plotted the distribution of the height of those buildings, you probably also would obtain a parallel distributions because those buildings are very different. But if you only picked a specific type of building, or only the 5-floor buildings, or you'll see that then you can obtain a normal you can see that you can obtain a bell-shaped curve distribution and not necessarily a parallel distribution. One thing that to keep in mind about the scale-free distribution is that there is sometimes a drop in the hubs. So the hubs, you cannot find infinitely large hubs. So although the power law curve would suggest that there are very large hubs, sometimes we see a drop in the size of hubs. And this can be explained by two mechanisms. So an interesting follow-up paper that came after the publications of Albert and Barabasi suggested an explanation for that drop in the distribution of hubs at the tail of the scale-free distribution. And this, like the building that we just looked at, suggests that there could be some type of a limit of how tall a building can be. They modeled two types of mechanisms that can explain this drop of the tail in the hubs. One is suggesting that the hub nodes age, and as they age, they lose the capacity to accept new links in the rich get richer model. Another one is that there is some type of a physical limit, a maximal physical capacity for a hub to grow, and once that hub reaches that maximal physical capacity, that hub will stop growing. We will talk more later about other mechanisms that can generate scale-free networks.